think you're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me
There you
now?
go. I can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Beal. Pleasure to be with you today. I am recently retired from Marathon Petroleum Company, the largest manufacturer of fossil fuel-based transportation fuels in the United States. My most recent role with Marathon was the Chief Financial Officer of its energy logistics business, MPLX, where I was also a management member of the board of directors. Aside from that role, I am also an independent board member of a financial services company that's a Fortune 100 company based in the United States, Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company. And I'm also an independent member of the board of directors of National Retail Properties. So I have a view into how many different companies are dealing with ESG and in particular the push toward decarbonization. Of course, the most prominent and direct connection is the Marathon Petroleum experience. So I look forward to unpacking that a bit with Regina and the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Pam. Let's go to Shailesh.
Thank you, Regina. I'm a out-and-out ESG centered director. I went through 500 hours of study during COVID to get a certification from competent boards out of Canada to make sure that my contributions on the 7 boards that I serve, including 2 which are subsidiaries of Holcim, the largest cement company in the world. I actually am pushing the agenda of renaming and making sure that the big thrust for decarbonization and indeed for ESG becomes visible on all the boards, the public listed boards that I serve on. And very interestingly, the non-public board that I serve on are also, in a sense, wanting to make sure that they become part of the scope 3. And that to me is a very fascinating collaborative trend that is emerging. So everybody wants to be in this together. It has truly become a world of collaboration. And that's what I would like to share and emphasize throughout this panel. Thank you.
That's great, Shailesh. And I know that everyone wants to hear more about what you learned over your 500 hours that you can impart to us in a truncated version. Marcy Reed, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcy Reed. I've been in the utility business for over 33 years. I'm now retired from National Grid, which is a US-UK regulated utility, $48 billion market cap. In my last role at Grid, I was the president of our regulated gas and electric utility business for the last decade. I also spent some time in finance and corporate affairs, which for us is where ESG lives. As for boards, I sit on Clean Harbors, which is publicly traded here in the US. I would say they have a robust, though still evolving, ESG process and reporting structure. And as an environmental remediation business, they've always been in tune with that aspect of ESG, but now they're diving more deeply into climate itself, decarbonization, et cetera. And then I sit on 3 other boards. They're all private. 2 are energy related and 1 in healthcare. And at those companies, ESG is discussed at the board level, and I know we'll get into that. A couple at the board, the full board itself, and 1 in the audit committee. So I'm looking forward to this panel. Regina, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Marcy. And last but not least, Jim Torgerson.
Thanks, Regina. I'm Jim Torgerson. I am the retired CEO of Avangrid, which is about a $20 billion market cap company in the US that's 81.5% owned by Iberdrola of Spain. So, and Avangrid has 8 utilities in New York and New England in the States. And then it's the 3rd largest generator of electricity from wind in the United States. So that's it's had a big ESG impact from its start. mainly through Iberdrola and the relationship we have there in Europe. I also serve on the board of Portland General Electric, which is an electric utility in the state of Oregon, mainly in the city of Portland. And again, their citizens like the idea that of ESG and decarbonization, so very relevant there. I also serve on the board of Archaea Energy, which is a newly formed company through a special purpose acquisition company. We did 2 mergers that closed in September, and the focus there is on renewable natural gas, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest, in the United States of producing renewable natural gas. So those have been my experience. Now I also serve on the board of a health system in the state of Connecticut, so that's my nonprofit contribution.
Well, so as the audience, you can see that we've assembled a stellar cast that has a range of extensive experience with ESG, but also extensive experience along the whole value chain of the energy industry. So let's just cut to the chase. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges that corporate boards are facing is obviously you're accountable for total shareholder value, total shareholder return, and these investments require quite a lot of capital. It might have a different return profile. It may not have it may not even pay. It may not even generate a return. So how do you manage threading that needle of driving the company toward a decarbonization agenda while still staying true to the mission of the board, which is driving total return for your shareholders? I'll say which one of you wants to start off with a big question that's on the table.
Well, I can start.
I'll do it.
Okay, Jim, go, and then Shailesh. Perfect.
Okay. Well, keep in mind that as an independent board member, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. I mean, that's really the role. So when you start looking at ESG, you have to think about what do the customers that you're serving want, and what do your investors want, and then you got to balance that. And you're kind of working at a fine edge at times because you have a business that's operating. For me, it's kind of easy with the 2 boards I'm on. Archaea in particular, they're doing renewable natural gas, which fits very well within the ESG and decarbonization focus. So, I mean, that was their focus when they started. They wanted to look at how to transition to the decarbonized world, and they focused on renewable natural gas. Portland General Electric is also similar in that the customers in Oregon really want decarbonization. So they focused away from their coal plants and are they're dismantling them over time and backing away from the coal and going to more renewable focus. So those 2 made it easy. But from a board member's perspective, we got to keep in mind that our job is to make sure that the shareholders are being served appropriately. And as you said, we have to make sure they're getting a return. If that can be coupled with how to work with ESG or decarbonization in the same vein, then we got a win-win. So, but management has to bring a lot of this to us, and we have to help them see where we should be going. So I think it's, right. It's a combination from both.
It's definitely nice when they're aligned. Shailesh, what would you offer?
So we focused over the last 2 years on 3 aspects: cost, cash flow, and safety. And when we drew the line between these 3 elements, we found that we need to think in terms of long-term costs or life cycle kind of costs. And that led many boards to think about what should be done to actually make the energy transition and make it cost effective so that the entire company switched its cost curve in a way that it permanently reduced costs. So let me give you 2 illustrations. So there is, you have 2 options. You either burn coal in a kiln, in a cement kiln, or you could incur the expense of picking up plastic waste and segregating it and make sure that the energy which is actually embedded in the plastic is used to get an equivalent amount of value to the kiln. And we found that we could actually go right up to 10% as alternative fuel when we could start doing this. And therefore, it became of course, there will be some additional cost to be incurred in gathering the plastic and sorting it and making sure that it's available and all of that. But it made a lot of sense. And let me give you another example, again from the cement industry. There is what is called fly ash, which is generated in the generation process of power when you burn coal. So what we did is we actually made sure that this fly ash got watered down and could be carried by rail as sludge to be utilized after drying. Again, mix it in the kiln with the other materials in order that we could reduce the carbon footprint. And when it turned so obvious that the entire cost curve of these companies was coming down, there was great enthusiasm from the board level, from the level of the CXOs, and actually throughout the company. Because we ended up having, post these innovations, the best quarter in history. And that is what is going to drive actions. So unless boards are able to get this pushed into the strategic plan and take these bold steps and think about total cost over effective life, we won't get the win-win-win that we want.
Right. So again, a great example of when there's alignment and the win-win-win. But Pam, what have you seen sitting in a more traditional part of the value chain that could be slower to adapt, and frankly, the cost issues are not as obvious, or the cost benefits are not as obvious? I think you're on mute again, Pam. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I feel like a telecommunications advertisement.
Yeah, that commercial.
Yes. So this is certainly getting a tremendous amount of attention at the board level at all energy companies. And if you're a provider of transportation fuels, your business is very much in the crosshairs and very much needs to be part of the solution. And I truly believe that the major energy companies today will continue to be the major suppliers of energy in the future, whether that's transportation fuels or whether it's power to the grid. So it is a significant question. It's one that's gaining a much greater attention and focus, especially when you're thinking about allocating capital for long term. So how long will your assets be relevant? And how fast is the pace of technology? And how quickly can it be deployed? It does seem as though there's a little bit more technology that needs to be developed. The cost curves need to come down tremendously in order to be really, truly competitive with the fossil fuel-based transportation fuels that we enjoy today. But we are seeing many companies in the transportation fuel space moving in the direction of renewable fuels, including Marathon. Marathon has announced 2 renewable diesel manufacturing facilities and has just had a demonstration using fuel for sustainable aviation, sugar-based technology. But some of these are extremely expensive and without economic incentives through policy, whether that's at the state level, as we see today in states like California, or whether it's at the federal level. There needs to be economic incentive to move these new technologies and future fuels into the forefront. And this is where the board, the larger the company, it seems like the more likely there is a special committee, as there is at Marathon, a sustainability and public policy committee that now has oversight of how the company will move forward. Of course, the entire board is very interested in strategy and how the strategy of the company will embrace the future and will be relevant and part of the transition, which we really like to call an evolution, because we think it will take a little more time than what a transition might suggest.
Right. It's definitely a process that we need to go through. Marcy, what would you add? And in particular, focusing on where Pam was starting to go, like what's the role of management? What's the role of the board? And within the boards that you've seen, where does the ESG decarbonization responsibility sit, special committees, full board? What are some of your thoughts on those topics?
Well, so for starters, I agree with everything that's been said, and I would sum that up by saying, to Jim's very important fiduciary responsibility point, what's the cost of doing nothing, right? So that is something that the board has to consider for the long-term economic viability and compliance and all of that. For the boards I've sat on, I would say they've all realized that the world is shifting, especially with respect to decarbonization and DEI. They are all dealing with it at the full board level. The healthcare insurance company on which I sit deals with it at the audit committee level. And frankly, I think everyone's trying to still figure out exactly what's right with all of the changes coming and the various standards that we all have to wade through and the alphabet soup of structures. I think that one thing that one of the boards I sit on discussed just this week was the need for the board members themselves to get educated. So Shailesh, I applaud you for going individually to do that. I think full boards need to see what training is out there, reporting trends, et cetera.
And Jim, what are you seeing relative to where the responsibility sits, special committees?
Yeah, the ones I'm on, it's really more the whole board that's focused on it, except when you start talking about the governance part of ESG, because we always have a nominating governance committee, so the focus is stronger in that one committee. ESG for Portland General Electric, we're focused on that in really audit and finance now, and then DEI is getting focused at the human resource or the comp committee level. So it's kind of a mix, but I have to say, and I agree with what Pam said, that a larger company can have a separate committee. I think when you have smaller companies that have a market cap of, let's say, 1 to 10 billion probably, you're probably looking at splitting this up within for the board as a whole, we'll be looking at it, and maybe certain aspects are in some committees separately, governance in particular being one.
Yeah, I think some of the details, from what I've heard, some of the details get worked in the committee, but the full board is taking responsibility and ownership and retaining the visibility of what is that strategy. So with COP26 and the acceleration around the topic, a lot of our listeners might be saying, well, how do I get started? And what have you learned along the way? So Shailesh, let's go to you with your 500 hours and your specific certification. How does one get started? And what are some of the steps that you've seen in the boards that you serve?
That's a fantastic question, Regina, because I break it up into 3 parts. One is you need an ERP of ESG. So just as SAP transformed us in terms of how we do our financial accounting, we need a revised ERP, which will enable us to measure and actually take care of all the other things that we need to get cognizant of and responsible for in the sustainability and ESG context. The good news for the world is that SAP has begun to start working on expanding their offering to make these capabilities available. But we will need a whole lot of IoT and sensors and measurements which are accurate and reliable and all of that. The second is that all companies will need to have a TEDx kind of conversation happening every once in a while at board level, at CXO level, and virtually at every level in the company. And so you need to find people who can communicate what is it that's going to get you there in the new world which will be with lesser carbon footprint, and what is the meaning of net zero commitment, and how do you make sure that the whole company starts believing in it. It's all about communication and awareness creation, and therefore I call it the Netflix of communication. And finally, you will need to have a running video like an OTT, which is the Netflix of actually demonstrating what you have done. And so if you can get these three things together, your measurement, your communication, and your outcome demonstration, then the entire organization starts working on it. In India, we have a very great advantage because 4 or 5 years ago, there was a mandate under the law that every company will need to spend 2% of its average profits of the last 3 years on what was called corporate social responsibility. India is the only country in the world where this is mandatory. So we already had a bit of experimentation, and so we had created CSR committees. Now we are transforming these CSR committees into sustainability committees. And the mandate is becoming larger. But the ownership has to stay with the CEO of the organization to make sure that what the board asks the right question, the CXO has to give the right answer. And that's the paradigm that we are working on to make sure that people can get started and move along and make sure that progress happens.
Right. Great summary. Thanks, Shailesh. Hey, Marcy, what have you seen, working with a company that has roots in the UK and the US? You've probably have a more progressive view of how to get started. What are some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, well, to build on what Shailesh was just saying, we for years have had a CSR component within our company. It was obviously in the US and UK, but probably, frankly, more present because of the progress that the UK has been making on topics related to CSR and, more importantly, or as importantly, climate. So we created our very first responsible business charter in pre-COVID land, which would have been around 2019, and it had in it our net zero commitment, practices we were going to adopt in order to meet that. It had, how we were going to attempt to drive changes in legislation and regulation in both the US and the UK. So I do feel fortunate to have had the UK arm of National Grid pushing us, because I think we've been a little bit slow to the gun just societally in the US. And although I see it really picking up now, I think it's fair to say we have not been moving quite as fast as others, but the board is fully on board. And as we discussed earlier, the other companies where many of us serve on boards, everyone is either dipping their toe in the water or they're full out in the deep end on trying to figure out exactly what needs to happen at the board level, how to organize around it, how to put your committees around it, what's the governance structure, what are the outputs. So it's exciting.
It definitely can't be ignored.
No.
Pam, what would you add? And then in particular, maybe you could say a little bit about what your investors or the analysts that watch the companies that you work with are requiring, demanding, asking for.
Yeah, well, I would just say the energy industry really has been on an environmental journey throughout its existence. Some of the early focus was on mitigating spills and safety incidents, and it migrated to reducing emissions of SOx and NOx and other criteria pollutants, taking lead out of gasoline. So I would just say the energy industry, and especially in transportation fuels, this is kind of an ongoing quest for continuous improvement. And we've seen this for some time. And as an industry, and in particular as a company, Marathon's been a leader. It was the first to publish its annual climate scenarios report. So we've been measuring and mitigating emissions of a whole variety, really, for a very long period of time. And as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions, that in particular has gained significant focus here recently. The investment community is also very focused on emission reductions, decarbonization, and what the energy industry is doing to advance this particular agenda. I would say that even within some shops, though, you will find on the compliance side of an institution, there's tremendous focus on reducing emissions and what's the company doing in that regard. But then on the portfolio management side, as you highlighted at the beginning, Regina, there is an expectation that corporations will continue to generate return on capital so that they can provide to investors return of capital. And so even within some investment shops, we do see a dichotomy there. Again, trying to thread the needle between those two. If we're going to remain in business, we have to generate returns on the capital that we deploy. And certainly, at the board level, how you allocate capital now and into the future is incredibly important, and it just as it is to our investors. So it continues to get a tremendous amount of attention, but it's interesting that we do see a bit of a dichotomy, Regina, when it comes to the investment shops.
Right. There's sometimes a little bit of you want to have your cake and eat it too. Jim, you're on the pointy end of the spear with assets in Portland and also Avangrid, third largest wind producer in the U.S. What were you hearing from investors when you were in the CEO role, and how has that perhaps changed over the last several years as the whole climate change conversation has accelerated?
Yeah, I retired in June of 2020, and the pandemic had just started, in February, March of that year. So weren't doing a lot of investor meetings at that time. But before that, we didn't hear a lot from investors. It was just starting to get the point where they'd ask a little bit about it. What were you doing? And they were focused more on our renewable business for Avangrid and how that was. And it wasn't really in the context so much of ESG. Now, talking to our CFOs of the companies I'm on the boards of, they're saying the investor interest and questioning on what they're doing has expanded greatly. They're getting questions all the time now on what are you doing as far as your environmental aspects? What are you doing to reduce your usage of coal? What are you doing in case of IKEA, what are you doing? This is great that you're going to be using renewable natural gas, but now what are you doing to sequester the output when you do burn it? Because you're still burning natural gas, renewable natural gas, but you're still burning it. Now, the trade-off is that instead of the methane escaping from the landfills and going in the atmosphere, you're capturing it and using it as a fuel. So you're getting a huge environmental benefit from that. But we're getting a lot more questions from investors on what are you doing and how are you going to continue to do this? So this is what I'm hearing from our CFOs and they're the ones that meet with investors. As a board member, I don't really meet with investors anymore. I used to a lot, constantly. But as a board member, that's really more management's responsibility is the way I see it. So, but I'm hearing from them.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Regina, if I might.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just going to add to that to say, you can look around the U.S., and I'm sure in other countries too, and sometimes, the activist investors are putting out, full out proxy fights for switching out board members and what have you. So though most of us have been fortunate to not be in that situation, you don't have to look too far to see examples of where these investors that you asked about are really, really engaged in making sure these companies are getting it right.
Right. How about in India, Shailesh, or do you have the activist investor pressure, and how much do the board members speak to the investor community directly, or is it management's responsibility, as Jim pointed out?
No, it is the active involvement of investors is at an incredibly heightened level. We have proxy advisory companies which are giving guidance on voting on every resolution, which is an absolutely new thing. We are having a lot of youngsters who are about to join companies, putting huge pressure. There's actually a shortage of high quality talent in India, as there is across the world. And the best jobs are being picked up, or the best people are being picked up by companies which have an ESG or a decarbonization soul. And this is becoming a widely voiced demand from the competent young people coming out of our IITs and IIMs and other educational institutions of very high promise. And I think this is the big factor that is working. I just brought out an article this morning in India's leading business weekly called Business India, which talks about how the investor relationship function has become critical to making sure that the ESG and the sustainability agenda of the corporation is actually fulfilled. And that role is going to get heightened as we go forward.
Yeah. Well, and as you pointed out, the Netflix for your narrative, the employees are a key audience for that narrative as well. And that drumbeat is getting louder and louder. One topic we wanted to pivot to was the energy transition itself and how the energy industry is approaching that, because I'm a firm believer that our industry will lead from the front, because we are the ones that develop a lot of the technologies. And maybe if we don't develop them ourselves, we at least find them and can scale them and can develop the capital around those technologies. And we still need a whole lot more technology to drive this transition, as I think, Pam, you pointed out. Marcy, I'll start with you. What are you seeing from the utility side of the business on how the energy transition is unfolding?
Well, I think it really comes in two totally separate buckets. So many of the larger companies and even some small ones have started up deregulated arms that focus on certain technologies that their customers are asking for. So, at National Grid, similar to Jim's experience at Avangrid, the strategy there has been to, yes, invest in some deregulated investments for clean energy technology, but also to very aggressively invest in and shape the dialogue around infrastructure development, customer-facing technologies that actually are within the regulated return. So sticking into rate base, energy efficiency, certainly transmission to large-scale renewables, EV chargers and related infrastructure, replacing leak-prone pipe on the natural gas side, installing geothermal systems. So there are lots of things that technologies that the utilities can invest in and continue to adopt that are within the regulated space and help their customers get to that place. I would say this, it all depends on a fairly deep interaction, not just with your regulators, but your customers, to identify what they want. And then the trick is to balance all of that with affordability, because we can do a lot of this and our customers simply won't be able to pay for it. So that, it's a balancing act. We talked earlier about the balancing the economics of the company, but there's also importantly, there's the customer that we need to think about. So I just think the good companies put a climate lens on everything they do, including their investments that they're doing right now, but also M&A and any other new revenue streams.
And maybe I can add to what Darcy was saying. When you look at a regulated utility, you got to work with the regulators to make sure that this is where they want to go. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of stranded costs that you just can't recover. So the objective is work with the regulators, work with the politicians, and as Darcy said, you really need to work with your customers and figure out what they're looking for as well. And also your investors too. I mean, that is a big part of it. But if you don't have the regulators on board, you're not going to be very successful at getting done what you think you need to do with the strategy you want to employ. So it's incumbent to be able to engage them directly.
It's incredibly tricky time to try to balance the climate agenda with affordability, because as you pointed out, Marcy, we could do a lot of things, but we may not be able to afford it. And then the other piece that you said that I think is really important is energy efficiency. If we're going to drive climate change, all of us as individuals have to start behaving radically differently, relative to the kind of vehicles we drive, the way we consume power, the supply chains that we insist on being able to ship something from China, overnight to have under my Christmas tree. Behavior has to change so that we all understand that. Pam, let's bring you in because on the downstream side, it's the same thing. I mean, I sit in Houston, Texas, and I see a lot of Ford 150, Ford 250 big fuel burning trucks on the road. I know Ford's announced an electric version of the Ford F-150, but it's going to take a long time for that drivetrain to change. How are you seeing things evolve when you are sitting in the downstream part of the business?
Yeah, Regina, I was just in Houston last week, and it's the first time I've been there in probably at least a year and a half. And I was really quite surprised just how heavy the traffic was. I was candidly expecting a little lighter traffic, just given the work from home and kind of the changes in behavior that people are experiencing. So I was quite surprised by the traffic. It actually took me 2 hours to get from the international airport down to the Galleria area. 2 hours,
yes.
Crazy. But so in terms of the transition, and I'll call it more evolution of energy, on the transportation side, clearly there are other technologies that do potentially have some promise, like hydrogen. There's certainly a lot of effort, a lot of money following that in particular. Of course, the one area that's getting the most support from policy and the most support, from an economic point of view, is electrification of transportation. There are a lot of unknowns in this energy evolution, but that is one known that we do see. And as you highlighted, electrification of transportation, even large vehicles, that will make them appealing to those who want to drive a Ford 150 pickup truck, or even a Hummer. They're coming out with an electric version. But it's when you think about the fossil fuel-based traditional fuels, they're hard to beat. They're very energy dense, they're easily transportable, and they're very affordable. And so herein lies one of the big challenges that a number of you have mentioned, and that is affordability. And so it's going to take significant technological advances in order for some of these alternative forms of energy to frankly compete with those aspects of the traditional fossil fuels. And everyone is for the climate agenda until they find out what it costs. And that potentially is a hindrance to moving faster, the cost of this energy transition or evolution. And so I think it is going to be incredibly important that technology plays a very prominent role as we move forward with this ambitious objective of decarbonizing our economies. So it's hydrogen is probably the next most promising opportunity with technological advancements. As I mentioned earlier, kind of the easy button that the transportation fuels industry will move to is the adjacencies that we call, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuels, fuels that can be generated from sustainable feedstocks.
Right.
And there's a limit to that as well. So we're seeing the costs of soybeans and corn oil, skyrocket as a result of the increased demand for that feedstock for transportation fuels. And so, in the past, we've seen a fuel versus food debate emerge from some of these crops. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I can't say that we all have the crystal ball to see exactly how it's going to evolve, but it'd be fascinating to be a part of.
It's a great time to be in the industry. But Shailesh, I've never seen traffic like traffic in India. So what are you seeing from the energy transition in your part of the world?
So we are seeing, I must compliment Pam for the comprehensive way in which she laid out the lay of the land. So the largest company in India has committed to green hydrogen, Reliance Industries. And what they are talking about is actually being able to capture and use hydrogen virtually like a battery cell. So they've allocated a large mass of land to go out and build these gigafactories at scale. Then there is a very nifty startup kind of company which has announced the making of two-wheelers, which will be pure EV. And so what that has done is it has got everybody in the two-wheeler market. As you know, India is the largest producer of two-wheelers in the world. And so almost everybody is trying to chase that dream of creating EV two-wheelers with batteries being charged in everybody's home, and with the transition happening towards every petrol station in the country having a space for recharging batteries. Trucks are moving very rapidly into becoming autonomous in a 5-year time horizon, and in the meantime, working on renewable fuels. The blending of methanol into fossil fuel-based petrol is now an absolute reality in India. And so we are working on all of these fronts of blending food-based or crop-based methanol into fuel, into EV vehicles, but we are doing it in a de-integrated manner. And I'd like to make 2 points here, which are very critical. Supply chains are getting not just regional, but actually very local. And the creation and utilization of renewable power is becoming completely de-intermediated and decentralized. So it's the village folk, for example, in India. As you know, 60% of India still lives in villages. They are beginning to harness solar power in their own small little way. And they are the ones who are enabling methanol to be blended into the fuels because of the crops that they are willing to sort of grow at scale. So these are two very critical new forces that have emerged in India: the decentralized de-intermediation and the supply chain getting absolutely local. As all of us know, Ray Kurzweil posits that in 2035, we will have a singularity where most manufacturing will be done on palm tops, and the energy that will be consumed will be purely renewable. So there you are, a glimpse into the future.
There you are. I like it. I love that. We're going to take a few questions from the audience in a minute, but the last major topic that we wanted to discuss is policy. I mean, you know, during COVID and even sort of following COP, there's been a lot of commitments on government spending to bridge the gap, because as Pam and others have pointed out, these technologies are not yet economic in a number of cases. So maybe I'll start with you, Jim. What would you like to see in the policy environment, or what do you expect in the policy environment that would enable an acceleration of our ability to achieve these climate objectives?
Yeah, you know, what I would like to see is that, you know, the nascent technologies, those are the ones that you really want the government to help with. Mm-hmm. Once it becomes a little more mature, then I think the government needs to kind of step away and let the market take over and let the market determine which ones are going to be most effective in moving things forward. But again, you have to start up somewhere. And I think the government policies that would help push the new technologies are the ones that they need to focus on, and not try to pick one, but just, you know, look at it a little more broadly so that you're not picking one technology which may or may not work. So you need to look at it broadly and get the investments there. But like I said, once you get it, then you really let the market take over and let the market decide what's going to evolve. But it takes getting to maturity, and sometimes that's been years. And if you look at wind and solar, it took quite a few years to get to the point where it's cost effective today. So it's going to take some time. And Marcy, you've seen a lot of it too. I mean, I know that. So I'm curious your guys' perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I totally agree with you that some intervention to kickstart technologies, you know, and R&D, including from the government, is essential, you know, to get it to scale, but then hands off, let the market work it. I think the other side of the policy coin, Jim, is that meanwhile, we do have a bunch of greenhouse gas emissions happening right now. So from a policy perspective, thinking about something like an economy-wide carbon tax that would incentivize companies to amend their behavior, their buying practices, and can even be a simple way to get companies' employees engaged on the topic. I think that's a way that we could think about accelerating the move to a more complete decarbonization and our push to net zero. And those funds, by the way, could be used to your first point, which is to invest in the R&D for the new technologies, infrastructure, et cetera.
At some point, we have to start valuing carbon, and so that we can create the offset markets for the hard to abate industries that aren't going to be able to decarbonize completely themselves. And we don't want it to be, greenwashing. It will be actual removal of carbon from the atmosphere.
Right.
And sequestration in some form or capacity. But until you have those market economics in place, you're not going to see the right market behaviors. So I think that's a really good point. Pam, what would you like to see from a policy perspective, or what do you expect?
Well, I'm one that likes to support incentives. As I mentioned earlier, I think tax credits are enormously motivational, especially given the entrepreneurial economic environment that we have in the United States. And I'll just point back to Jim's experience with Archaea. Things will happen if there's an economic incentive for it to happen. And right now, we see more of that on more of a regional basis as opposed to at scale across the country. So I'm one who favors economic incentives in the form of tax credits instead of taxes. Really, we want as a country, and I think as globally, we want energy to be very affordable. We don't want to raise the cost of energy. We want it to be affordable. There are many people across the globe that still don't have access to basic energy like electricity. So that's my view, that if we have the right economic incentives through tax credits, we'll see the right outcomes. The other thing I would say is, what gets measured gets done. And we do expect there will be more guidance in terms of reporting. And this is where, audit committees will come in. Potentially, compensation committees will come in to play, where they're measuring progress on emission reductions and perhaps tying some of those to those incentives to compensation for executives. So I think there are a number of different ways that policy and reporting and putting the right spotlight on what we're trying to achieve can be very helpful.
Great, really good points, Pam. And to your point about tax incentives, I participated in a tax policy debate with some colleagues a few weeks ago, and in the course of preparing for that, I dove deeper on Texas, and the series of tax incentives that existed in Texas to promote wind generation, such that Texas is now the single largest wind generator in the country. It is a great story, and it was tax incentives, but it was also local policy where the government agreed to build the transmission infrastructure to take the electricity from the very windy part of West Texas to which is not populated to the populated parts of East Texas and locations like Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. Incentives is an important thing. Shailesh, what's happening in India? You were mentioning the 2% average profit on CSR, so already an interesting policy move. What else might be coming, or what would you like to see, or what do you expect?
So actually in India, what is happening is exactly what Pam was talking about. Way back in the 2020 budget, the incentives for green hydrogen were announced by the government. And that, it took us all by surprise. I never imagined that they would go into such a future-oriented technology and talk about electrolysis using renewables so that you don't get into the blue or the brown or the black hydrogen controversy that Japan seems to be getting into today. But we had a clear direction to go to green hydrogen. I'm fully in favor of incentives. But what is required really is two other things to accompany all of these tax changes. One is a change of mindsets. The reason why we are in the shape that we are today is because we took it into the minds of human beings that we should create the Anthropocene era. Last 200 years, we have created so much material which is human made that it today exceeds, in 2020, that material exceeded all the material that exists elsewhere in the world, which is a statistic that stunned me. And I think this is important to convey at scale to the whole world. Look at what you're doing. Stop it. Start reutilizing. Start making sure that you don't produce more and more of this Anthropocene material, which is creating the warming. That is the crucial message that needs to go out, that mindset change. It's so critical that this happens. The other thing that must happen is that we don't want to again hand over to the large agglomerations of money which will profit from the way that we scaled up everything in the Anthropocene era. We need to decentralize it and take it down to where it can be done in a de-intermediated, very simple, low-cost, democratic way. So if we do these two along with the tax piece, then we have a real chance of making a dent.
I like that. Well, very well said. Okay, so I've got a few questions from the audience. The first is, should board members engage more externally with regulators and investors? Should you be more active?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Shailesh says yes. Jim says no.
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 Marcy says no. Say more on the no side.
Well, it's really the role of management to be dealing with the regulators, and that's their job. Our job as board members is oversight and to make sure they're doing things in the correct way and getting things done. We, as a board member, I don't have all the knowledge that the management does. And for me to step in and assume I did, it'd be a mistake for the company. So in my mind, my job is oversight, and it's management's job to deal with regulators.
Shailesh, why are you yes? What's the yes vote?
So I'll tell you why I say yes. See, the ear of the government and the regulators is open to communications from people at board level. So if you see what happens at the time of budget formulation, particularly in India, and I know that that happens in the UK as well, they bring in people who are in positions of influence to talk about what they see is happening in their space in order for policy to be oriented towards what will work. And that's why I think board members cannot shy away from actually interacting with regulators. Look at also the way our BRSR, which is the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting, was formulated. It happened because the regulator got together a whole bunch of senior, seasoned people, took their inputs, and are continuing to take their input on how should it be made widespread. So I agree with Jim that we should not step in and make sure that we substitute what management is supposed to do. But in terms of influencing policy and influencing government, the role of senior, wise board members is absolutely essential.
Well, I like having a debate, so that's good. Another question is, you want to?
I just wanted to add. I understand what Celeste, what you're saying. If you're not dealing with the company specifically with a regulator, that's the management's job. If you want to be viewed as a senior advisor, so to speak, and talk to regulators on a broader scale, I could see that happening.
Okay.
That's what
60 seconds for one more question. and I'll get Marcy to do this one. What should the incentives for boards and the executive team be to drive ESG?
Well, the management team must be incented through their annual compensation goals and targets, which the compensation committee of the board determines and monitors. I think that the board, should they be compensated separately for ESG? I would say no. As I think someone said it earlier, the strategy of the company has to embrace and embed ESG within it. So I don't see it as separate. It's all part of the strategy of the company.
Great. Very well said. Okay, we've got 3 minutes. It's time for final thoughts, rapid fire. Pam, you go first. What is the final thoughts you want to leave with our audience?
The future is bright. The energy industry is up to the challenge, and it will be a leader in the solutions.
The future is bright. I got to wear shades. Jim, 30 seconds.
I think, keep in mind the board's your responsibility as a board member. I think the future is bright too. I agree with Pam on that. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be a challenge, but there's huge opportunities in this space for people.
I agree. I think it's a terrific time to be in the industry. I'm so excited that I get to, have a role to play and a seat at the table. Shailesh, what are your final thoughts?
So my thought is 1, 1, 1. Make sure that we can have energy consumed at the price of 1 cent a unit. Today we are at close to 4 or 5 times that. So I want to see it come down. I want to see it happen in 1 decade, so in 10 years, to make sure that all the energy mixes that we can get together through technology, through decentralization, all the things we talked about, do it in 1 decade. And the third one is put the consumer and the human race at the center. Make them number one. So 1, 1, 1.
Perfect. Okay, Marcy, you get the final word.
Well, everyone just strap on your seatbelt, baby. This is such a great time to be in the energy industry, focusing on the customer and the human, as Shailesh just said. But I think we talked about communicate, keep having conversations like this. It's a hugely exciting time.
Very exciting, and I think there's some terrific messages. So I want to say thank you all 4 very much. It's been a really enjoyable 60 minutes. I'm very grateful that you took time out of your busy schedules to share your wisdom and insight with our audience. And to those of you watching with Enrich, there's another day tomorrow. Anish and the team in India have done an absolutely fantastic job as our global head of energy. I could not be more proud of what the team has produced and the quality of conversations that are ongoing. Please feel free to reach out to any of us at KPMG if you have any questions or want to discuss this further. But until then, if you're in the US, have a great rest of your day. If you're in India or in Asia, good night. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Kudos to KPMG. Fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, Marcy.
Kudos to you, Regina.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
The world has changed, and it's not just because of COVID. Consumers and employees have increasingly different expectations of the world and the businesses they buy from and work for. Your shareholders and lenders are under pressure from regulators and the market to prove that they're acting responsibly and investing sustainably. All will be making choices about which organisations they work with. So will yours be one of them? Each stakeholder looks at your business through their own lens, and this is your opportunity to choose what's behind it. What is your impact on our planet? What do you contribute to the communities you operate in? And how do you conduct yourself? ESG isn't something you do, it's everything you do, and how you do it. It's your license to operate, and it's your opportunity to lead. Your ESG strategy must be authentic, embedded in your business strategy, and owned by your board. Your ESG narrative looks right across your business and tells that story to the world. And your ESG metrics help people compare you with others, often via a rating. You'll want to consider how you conduct yourself as an organisation and look to the ethics throughout your supply chain. What part do you play?